Hey sports fans, Coach Nick here and welcome to BBallBreakdown. I'm very pleased to have Eric Weiss, who is the founder of Sports Aptitude, and what he does is uses behavioral science to better understand who the player is as a person and how they'll fit into that environment of an NBA team. So Eric, I thought we could jump right into it and talk a little bit more about what you do for walking from the very beginning of when you look at a player from the pre-draft process and how that goes along.
So basically we start with traditional scouting information. We want to track a player as long as possible, basically. And what I do is I study their reactions to situations instead of studying their technical form on their jump shots. I'm looking more about how they handle being a first option for the first time or how they deal with adversity in certain situations. And so collecting that information over a long period of time, I take notes just like any scout would do. And then once we get to the draft itself, then each player will take a standardized behavioral assessment, much like a lot of businesses give to their employees, including Google, using a profile, a psychological profile that matches certain behavioral indicators to success in certain roles. We then start to communicate with the player personnel director, with various other scouts, direct interviewing, again, to corroborate some of these things with the player. And we use all that information to try to make an accurate assessment based on the over 950 players in my database, seeing what the comparables are and whether or not those things are being displayed, and then trying to match that person with the role and the expectations that the interested team has for that person.
Well, let's talk about a couple maybe red flags that you might see. I have to imagine, from my standpoint, you're watching perhaps what happens when a player gets taken out of a game and how he reacts to that. Are those the kind of things that you're looking at?
The one thing that I really take pride in is, I think like most of us, we always dreamed of being a player. So I've always taken the perspective of, I feel like I'm the advocate in this area for the player. So red flags that are traditionally thrown out there, I tend to be a little bit more situation specific than looking at red flags. Now, you of course point out anything that you think might be a risk area, but I do believe that there is a match. If you're willing to work with the individual, you have to make the determination of that work and that effort is worthwhile for the situation. But the biggest red flags, I guess, are really just determining the opportunity a player is going to get and the situation relative to things like how well do they process stress? What's the balance between emotional versus logical decision making? These things aren't red flags in isolation, but if you take a player, for example, and say, okay, well, this player took a long time to matriculate up to his level of performance in college. So he was a multi-year collegiate performer. His role ramped up gradually and he got to a certain level because his skills improved. Sometimes the assumption is, okay, he's arrived now, so now he can handle this job. Whereas I might want to look at some of those indicators like his receptivity to instruction, his ability to change, his emotional and logical reasoning. You look at these things and you say, well, wait a second. He might have developed to a point where he could play a specific role, but that back history of that slow growth and development, having someone in front of him to take the pressure off, might be exactly what that player needs in order to duplicate that success on the pro level.
So it sounds like what you almost would do is create a report that perhaps the head coach would read and then sort of understand better how to communicate with the player to get the most out of him.
Yeah, that's certainly a part of the process. I think most of my communications in the past have usually been with front office personnel for selection. I have had my reports read and also communicated a number of times with coaches. We tend to interpret things the way that we would react to it in the absence of understanding the differences between the player and ourselves or anybody in any situation. And this is kind of basic relationship therapy in a lot of ways when you talk about, okay, well, what are we trying to do? We're trying to understand the viewpoint of the other person. So in a lot of ways, what I try to do is give the organization a better understanding of what makes the other person tick. So when they see a particular action or behavior, they don't assume that it was caused by something that would have made them react that way. They understand a little bit better about why that person reacts to those situations.
You know, if a player was watching this and they really want to know, gosh, I want to look good on all levels. I know my playing is going well, but I want to make sure that these teams see me in a positive light. You know, what would you suggest? Are there little key things that you see right away that are either red flags or positive signs?
Like I said, I feel like I'm an advocate for the players because a lot of this gets lost in the equation, and these kids are pretty young. I mean, 19, 20. I didn't know anything when I was 19 or 20, even though I thought I knew a lot more than I did, like most of us. So, you know, for players, you know, the honesty is the best policy. You know, if there's something that that everyone knows, trust me, these guys do enough background checking and digging that, you know, don't dodge questions and try to deflect accountability for situations. Figure out what part of it you were responsible for, if it's something that's that significant. And other than that, you know, be yourself. I say it all the time, but they like your talent anyways. You've already made it to the point where they care about talking to you about this stuff. So I think the biggest thing is to be true to yourself and embrace, you know, who you are and try to get that out instead of trying to impress anybody. I know it's an audition in a lot of ways, but you've kind of already gotten the part. You're just up for, you don't know which team is going to cast you, I guess, for the role. So if you represent who you are, then they're going to get the clarity that they need to make a decision not on whether or not you have any worth, but whether or not the fit is best for you. And ultimately, fit is, I think, everything. This fit leads to opportunity, and opportunity leads to success.
I like that idea. Certainly, we've seen plenty of players in the league who have struggled until they finally find that one team and that one culture or that one coach that somehow it all does fit together. And I'm sure would you even want to hazard a guess of how many players never actually find that right fit?
And this is, you know, I wish I had more specific research, and that's actually, you know, what I've been doing in conjunction with Draft Express. We'll have a series of research articles coming out on behavior, and I'm hoping to really be a thought leader in this area by treating the behavioral data as an indicator of the differences between people. We can then map against, you know, the best thing about sports is that everything's recorded. There's data points for everything. When you're trying to figure out the office environment at Google, that's a little bit more complicated, but you can see minutes here, you can see usage rate, you can see shot opportunities, you can see everything. So there's a lot of measurable behavioral outcome information. With that being said, yeah, of course, I think opportunity, the idea that everyone gets their fair shake, logic shows you that if you're not in the top 10 on the roster out of 15 people in the NBA, how many practices are there going to be? How many reps are there going to be? How good is the communication with the lower tier, less essential players? How much is their voice heard in the process and their wants and needs understood? There's a million human elements that are very basic HR practices in normal mainstream corporate America that don't really get realized in this environment. And it's tough to really have everything line up and get the opportunity. So I'd say there's dozens of players that could have made it, but because of situational variables that weren't accounted for, they missed their window and they became less than they ultimately might have been if under different circumstances.
It sounds like you might actually have to do an assessment of the team itself as rigorous as you would do of the player.
Yeah, well, ultimately, that would be ideal. And I've had some clients that are more aggressive clients, have been doing this for 10 years now, that really will get into some deep dynamics. And hopefully, the more we can do that, the more we can quantify. But just studying an entire group, the fact that the process, like I said, of awareness, starting to think in those terms is a huge step forward to starting to understand, okay, well, what kind of time can we allocate? You have maybe 5 or 6 assistant coaches. You have a whole support infrastructure that's there. If you have a slight paradigm shift in thinking and start to say, okay, well, we're not just going to be responsible for shooting guards. We're going, and this coach is responsible for the big men. Now let's start to look at the individual and say, well, what does this person need? Do they need their mother and their brother to move with them to make the acclimation process easier? Do they need to be in a locker next to a stronger work ethic veteran who they'll be receptive to that type of communication? It's small, subtle things that you can do that happen by accident and that clearly are understood in some way by organizations because you hear it all the time. But to actually manage that process a little bit more, to really strategically and proactively try to put those wheels into motion. Nothing's perfect, but a little bit more awareness a little earlier can get that process started faster and probably increase the effectiveness of success.
It's all just fascinating stuff. Really quickly, body language. We talk a lot about that on the court, and how astutely are you focusing on that and how they carry themselves in the course of a game, even during the free throws and during timeouts?
That's actually a ton of what I do during summer league, since that's when I have the data on all of these players already. I look for observable indicators of behaviors that we've measured for, and I have a categorical system for collecting that information. And body language is a huge part of it. When you know a guy is a high stress, emotionally volatile person, you see subtle elements of that. You see a guy missing a free throw, and you see him swearing under his breath, and you see that look where he's not present anymore, but he's in his own head reviewing a million things. It's like we've all seen those things, but when you know which players are more susceptible to allowing that to kind of unravel or roll downhill, and which players maybe they're just hard on themselves, but they bounce back faster, a million different factors. That's extremely important to know, like, who the person is and whether or not that body language is actually indicative of of a risk that needs to be controlled in a certain way, or whether it's something that doesn't need as much attention.
Well, all fascinating stuff, and it really, I think, opens up a lot of people's eyes to just how deep these teams will go to assess these players before they give them millions of dollars, which is a big, big consideration. So thanks for coming on the show and giving us a little glimpse into what that's like. I'm anxious to hear even more what you're going to do with Draft Express. It sounds great. And don't forget, sports fans, at B-Ball Breakdown, we're not a channel, we're a conversation. You win.